Yep. Okay, everybody repeat
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, first up is the discussion of response to a centralized arraignment process. I know people have been collecting statistics and things of that sort. I don't know if we've answered everybody's questions to their satisfaction, or if there's more to be said on this one. And we're not adopting it tonight, it just means it'll end up on the agenda on December 16th. So you still get the chance to change your mind, but the thought here is at this point, at least in my mind, we're only asking the Office of Court Administration to sort of pause this rollout and consider the concerns of the various chiefs of police. So it's not like we've, drawn a line in the sand and said, if you cross that, something will happen. It's more just, these are our thoughts. So I suppose the question is, would anybody have an objection to putting it on the agenda? No.
No,
Okay.
I'm not putting on the agenda.
All right, well, that's an easy one. Let's find one that's gonna be more difficult here. Land use regulation streamlining effort. See if I can find the memo. Probably when I first wrote that memo, that predated you, is that correct? Trying to remember, I sent something around.
It went to.
Or maybe I sent it to you guys,
Yeah,
but
they
it
were
was,
included on it.
yeah, okay. Let's see here. So if there are any objections to the charter itself, you can give them tonight, or we can do it in the next couple of days, but we have to sort of, actually next day, we have to lock it in. But that is what most people have seen, and it's fairly general. You see the list of potential members, and I call them potential members only because, assuming we walk away from this with everybody saying, okay, well, this is a good idea, let's do this. I've got to send them all an email that says, hey, remember when you said you were going to do this, are you still willing to do it? I expect most of them will say yes. Many of them I've contacted recently and some talked directly to. It's a pretty good cross-section of people. In my mind, there are some open issues, particularly who we appoint as chair, and I'm not saying we have to pick somebody who's going to run the whole thing, but to me, and if you just put a group of people, especially one as large as this one, in a room together and say, figure out who's in charge and what you're going to do, you're inviting chaos. So even having somebody who's just sort of the procedural leader for the first meeting and then they pick a chair themselves, I'd be okay with that too. It's probably, I'm not going to dictate this to the committee, but this is just an observation. It may be best that it's not somebody who's in an existing role on one of the land use committees, because not that they have a vested interest, but I don't want this to turn into a turf battle. And if there are discussions, I would rather not have somebody who is a member of the planning board or the ARB or the ZBA making the decision as the chair. Not that I think they would do a bad job, but I think it just makes it a little cleaner. And there was some, I think it might have been your comment, Arlene, about we should, there may be times when the committee itself wants to meet without members of the actual land use committees, which is going to be a little difficult if your chair, I mean, I suppose you could have an acting chair, but if your chair has to recuse themselves on something like this. So maybe when I send, if there's no objection, when I send the email, I can ask if anybody wants to be the chair. And if they, if they think it would be a good idea to let them pick their own at some point and just have somebody who's the initial chair and does the follow-up. So I'm open to hearing what people think about this. I think there were some other issues that I had raised within my email, but most of the discussion we've had in the past had to do with sort of suggestions, approaches that they could take. And I don't necessarily want to dictate what approach they should take to try to get to this. I don't mind making, give them a list of suggestions and whatnot, but if I wouldn't want to try to sort of jam in the charter, you will do a survey, you will do this, you will do that. I'd rather let them find their way. But again, if somebody wants to argue the contrary, I'm listening.
No, I just have a question about the potential members. Were these people that like stepped forward and wanted to be part of this, or were these people that were tapped by this?
It's a whole range. There was a group originally that said we should do this and put forth a bunch of names. Might have come from the Irvington taxpayers originally, so maybe that's half dozen names. Then I think I sent an email out on this subject saying we're going to do this. Is anybody interested? And a bunch of people said I'd like to do that. And then the board itself said, we probably ought to have representatives of every committee. So I reached out to the chairs and I said, can you give me somebody on your committee, or yourself if you want to do it, if you're not too busy. And I got some people that way. And who knows how else some of the other folks, it's just, it was sort of organic. It wasn't, there's a couple here, folks who, like I see Paul Frickalora here, who had come to make comments, or Connie, who was, Kehoe, who was very much involved in the historical aspects, who had made comments previously and said, let's say in a public meeting, said they'd be interested, so I just sort of took their names down, and that's the end result of this. So.
I think for like the public, I think it's important to know that because what's contemplated by the streamlining committee involves and touches on both three boards, and that there are lots of regulations that people have to know about, and those land use boards go and they get training at PACE, and I'm sure other training, that is important to know if you're going to streamline, what things are, because there are certain zoning regulations that you have to kind of understand and respect, and maybe part of what the recommendation is to change them, that's one thing, but that you have to know that it's not willy-nilly, you can't change it. So I think it is important to have representatives from all of those boards. That's number one. And then I think clearly we felt like you need representatives from the community, that's important as well. So I think this is intended to be kind of a committee that is encompassing of a lot of groups. I envision that they might have to have lots of subcommittees or meetings where they're going to have to, for lack of a better word, exclude people or ask people to kind of step away from that meeting. But I think it's important that we don't dictate what they end up doing, but that they understand that there's a lot of latitude in what they can do, and because at the end of the day we want a better process. So I do think we can name someone to kind of head it, but ultimately that person needs to come from that group. They need to decide who that's going to be.
And I think this goes to something one thing I left off my list here at the beginning. We wanted to have sort of a common language. You were talking about how the boards get training. We will probably, and we have to talk more about how we do this, but maybe bring somebody in from PACE to do a training course for everybody. I know for some of them it's going to seem very remedial, but I'd rather have everybody with an understanding of how our code works. It could be Mary Ann even.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good possibility.
Because they may be asking her for advice later anyway. That'll help those folks whose experience has been, I once did a renovation and it was good or it was bad and I don't understand why something happened. If they're really going to help us figure out how to improve the process, and I think that means make it run a little more smoothly, and maybe, I think we had the chair of the planning board in here a meeting or two ago saying, there's a couple things that I don't even know why, I'm putting words in his mouth. Oh, you're right there, you're sitting right in front of me, okay. But I'll be very careful as I'm putting words in your mouth. He said something to the effect of, these things don't necessarily need to be in front of the planning And I'm not gonna tell you what they are because they'll come up in the meeting, but I'm sure every committee has something like that, that they could do in a slightly different way. The other thing, and this may be a little unfair to ask of the group, but we have to figure out how to address the fact that the ARB, we're having trouble getting an architect to serve on that, and I'm gonna try another community outreach myself, but and maybe a mayor's letter or something of that sort to try to get somebody. But if we don't, we need to figure out how exactly we're gonna address that problem. And this is probably the right group to do that. And I know that there was a proposal made probably just as I was coming on, and we put it aside in favor of doing this, I think would be a fair way to describe it. But if that needs to come back, if the committee tells me, hey, that's what you should do, I think what it effectively did was turn the ARB into more of a body that recommended things to the planning board. It was another advisory group. I'm not dictating that, but it is a problem that really should be addressed. So when we're sort of giving them lists of things, recommended things to do, that would probably be on the list. So anybody else wanna?
I just want to say I agree with what you said about not trying to legislate what they should be doing, and certainly with what Arlene said about making sure there's representation. And I'm not really concerned with how the chair process goes. Just the one thing I think is important is that I think, and it's axiomatic, but they have to follow what the charter says. In other words, I think the charter lays out very clearly and simply, it's not a long document,
Right.
what it is their job is, and I don't think the committee would do anything other than that. But if for some reason they came back and and wasn't following this, and then I think that would be disappointing. But other than that, I don't think we need to change anything because it's right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fair. Everybody else okay with that? So maybe my next step, I guess, will be first to find out that the potential members are still members. And then presumably this will come up in a January meeting where we actually adopt the charter and then start to put people on it. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, capital budgeting process. You're now going to eliminate all confusion I've ever had about something.
No, I don't think so, but there's still
Thank you,
plenty
Larry,
of
that was
room.
very diplomatic. It's impossible.
That was an underhanded compliment. You're right, so this discussion really was prompted by, a little bit of miscommunication, I would characterize it as, in the way that we have been presenting the capital budget in, actually it's been many years, but it really just kind of came to light this year. And it relates to projects that, typically relates to projects that are in need of approval, but the bonding, the borrowing doesn't necessarily need to happen right away. The way we present that in our capital budget is that the project appears in the year that borrowing is anticipated. But in fact, the borrowing isn't always aligned with the start of the project and the need to really get going on the project. And so there are two examples of this, and then Katie can talk a little bit about what we would propose to do in kind of a high level way. But the two projects, the two best examples are the stage in Matheson Park and the Downingwood Culvert. Both of those projects are the recipient of grant funds. In the case of Matheson Park Stage, we received $500,000. That grant contract was approved by this board back in January. And then in May or June, when we had the approval of the capital budget, that project did not appear as a 24-25 project. It appeared as a 25-26 project because we don't need to borrow the money until next fiscal year. The project is under design right now. We have money in the bank, essentially from the grant. And the borrowing for the actual construction really doesn't have to happen until after June 1st of '25. So that's the way we presented it. But I think we completely understand that someone else, either on this board or in the community, may look at that and say, well, that project's not approved yet. And, you know, it's going to be debated this spring at the capital budget adoption process. So unfortunately, you know, we've been spending, you know, almost $100,000 probably on the design work, which is funded by the grant at this point. But there's a lot of money being spent, and, you know, we need to know that that project's approved, is essentially what has to happen. So I don't know if you want to, Katie, if you want to take them through a little bit about what we're thinking for next time around.
Yeah, so we think the, it's just probably a presentation, issue that we can fix. So at the time of the capital budget, even, so say we did it correctly when we last did it for the Matheson Park stage, on the report, I could just put like an asterisk and write, you know, approved as part of the 24-25 budget to be borrowed in 25-26. Because the debt schedules in the front of the capital budget, the purpose of those is to kind of give a picture of what the borrowings and the debt service payments will look like going forward. So I like to have that match the years in the budget layout, but as long as we put just a note there saying this project was approved.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna ask you, so I think for the public, it's just that in your debt servicing schedule, even though that project is approved, it's not there because the borrowing hasn't happened. And, right, like, yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
two can be separate.
They have to be, yeah, they're separate, but, and I think for most projects, right, I think in discussing the capital budget with people, if you have most of the years, right, we have the capital budget in the current year that we're approving, and then there's planning for future projects that are not approved. This is different because you have to approve it, but we delay the borrowing. So I think a notation is the way to cure that.
Yeah,
And just maybe for your benefit, only because Arlene's heard me say this today, and I think Mitch is probably familiar with it, but the implication is that when you get to next year's capital budget, you need to know that you've already blocked out $1 million for that stage. So if you were thinking, I got another, you know, our average borrowings, let's say it's 4 to 5.
That depends on the year.
Yeah, okay.
Oh,
All
it's
right.
not that high?
Let's assume it's no more than 4.
Yeah.
You've already had a quarter of what you could have gotten spoken for. So if you thought, I'm gonna get a fire truck and I'm gonna get whatever, you may have to reconfigure things. And that was really my issue, as much as I may have been confused about the degree to which it was already approved. My issue is more concerned about making sure I'm not too heavily weighting a particular year when I thought I could spend money, because I just didn't realize we were locked in for that. I certainly understand that if you're dealing with a grant situation, it's probably a bad idea not to be committed for the, you know, you ought to be able to make the decision up front. It's either a yes or a no. And
Right.
while theoretically we could back out of both of those projects, that would be incredibly, I suppose, unwise, and we wouldn't make any friends at other levels who have put money forth for our benefit.
Right, and frankly, it would be costly, because not just costly in future opportunities.
But we spent money on it.
But we already spent money, and
Yeah.
we
Nobody's
we
gonna
would pay it
reimburse
back,
us.
is basically what happened. They wouldn't, you know, they pulled the entire funding.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, there's a practical aspect to that too, so.
Yeah.
Could we see, could we see like what's been done so far, like some of the pre-planning and what's been spent, on, like, would that be possible to get like an update at some?
Did you send the?
Yeah, so there's been 2 things that have gone around. First was the site civil engineering work. And then the second thing was the architectural that's been going around. We're looking for comments from the Parks and Rec Department and the theater. And the design team is looking for us to tell them that the design that we see is acceptable, so that they can go ahead and finalize it. We're trying to get that finalized by the end of the year or first part of the new year, so we can get bid documents out and, hopefully construction during the middle of '25. I mean, that's what we're targeting. So,
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of note that when we're working with grants, often we have to commit the rest of the funds to the project. So that there's not like the maybe later. So sometimes I think we just recently had a grant where we were like, okay, we're gonna commit to this grant no matter if
Solar.
part of the
Solar,
solar,
that's right.
exactly. So I think that's also important that like, you sort of make these commitments and we have to obviously, we have to live up to those commitments.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll do a better job of making that clear in the documents that you look at in the spring in your capital budget, just to be, better disclosure on that, so there's no confusion.
And there was also, from 2022 in the capital budget was the Matheson Park stage design piece, which was previously approved and part of that year.
So we've been, I mean, from a staff standpoint, we've been working at it diligently to get it moving and to come up with the least expensive way to build it and all of that. So, to have the rug pulled out at this point would be very difficult and costly.
And I was aware, obviously I was aware of that because I had seen some of the things you're doing. I just thought there was another piece that when we went to the capital budget, which is why I even asked you, well, we're not gonna wait till the capital budget in May or June, we're gonna have to do something up front.
Right.
So now I
Yeah.
get the process, and it'll help if you mark it on the spreadsheet. Were you also asking a question that went to dollars, or was it design?
Both, I'm just
Oh,
curious how
alright.
it connects.
Because you
We
could,
can get you,
yeah, they,
we can get a report for that,
Yeah,
sure,
thank you.
for the
all right,
declaring.
anything else on this one?
No, the Downingwood culvert is another example of this. We're not as far along in that design. In fact, I have nothing to show you right now because they're, really pretty early on. But that's another one that you probably will not see construction until, well, I said optimistically that sometime in '26, but actually I was.
You were corrected.
Yeah, it might be even a little later than that, but it's a federal contracting process, so it's very lengthy. But it's paying for 75% of the project, so it's a significant grant, it's 1.4 million, so it'll be worth waiting for from that standpoint. But that's another example of a project that we'll be designing probably over the next 12 to 18 months and spending money. And, the construction's not gonna happen until '26, maybe '27. So,
Got it. And,
A major flood event before then.
well,
yeah,
I mean, we could proceed on our own, but it would be without the state's money.
Yeah, no, we can't.
from a procedural standpoint, there will have to be a borrowing resolution at some point that will encompass both of these projects at the appropriate time. That's a question. Okay.
Yeah, so once the capital budget is approved, then comes the bonding resolutions, which are a separate approval, and then projects funded by fund balance are usually a separate resolution. So this is step one, and then there's various other steps that happen
And I
after.
think you may have spoken to this, but just so that I remember it this time around, once we've given you the advance approval, or even the borrowing resolution, it's your decision when the appropriate time to borrow is, correct?
Yes. So when we have bans outstanding, we're a little less flexible because those are only for 1 year.
Right, they're
At
gonna
this
roll over.
point, all of our borrowings are in bonds, so the timing isn't as strict. It's
Got
pretty
it.
much once we need the money and have enough to go out for the borrowing is when we would do
And-
that.
Are we allowed, from an accounting perspective, to defer borrowing, let's say, to use the stage as a hypothetical, to defer borrowing for that piece and use fund balance, and then later borrow the full amount so that you replenish the fund balance? You can still allocate that portion of the borrowing to whatever the useful life is of that stage? If you don't know
I
the
think
answer, you
so,
don't
but
have
I
to
would
answer
have to
now.
check with
Okay.
bond counsel on the
Yeah,
specifics.
because there may be reasons external to what we do, like rates and where our expectation about where they're going.
That's an advanced funding resolution. We've done that before. As a matter of fact, we did that on the Firehouse Facility Project, where the board passes a resolution saying that these funds are gonna be spent out of fund balance, and when there's a bond resolution, they'll be replenished from
Got it.
that.
Okay,
But you have to do that on a project-by-project basis, and it's not a routine thing that Katie can just
understood.
decide to do.
You'd only do it for, actually, one of these two, since they're $1 million or multi-million-dollar projects.
Yeah.
Theoretically, I'm not suggesting we should do it that way.
I think one of the things, and I know we talked about this,
Yeah.
kind of offline, is we need to check with bond counsel, because one of the ways that might make more sense and would actually be more transparent and make sense is that when a project like the stage was approved in '24, do the bond resolution at that point in time. That triggers an estoppel period that allows the public, with public notice, allows the public to file a petition against it if they wish, which it doesn't routinely happen, only happens in large firehouse projects. But that in that way, once the bond resolution is passed, it may be that then at that point, the treasurer can sit on that and borrow only when needed. And if that's legitimate to do, we'll check with bond counsel. That may be a better way to do it, so that we will still have footnotes about it, because the borrowing is gonna impact what our debt service levels are. But it'll eliminate any questions as to whether a project is approved or not, or it'll better solidify it.
Got it, okay.
Just a thought. But we're not making these decisions
I
here.
know,
We're
I
just-
understand.
Just laying out what some of the possibilities
Yeah,
are.
I was just sort of exploring options, so.
Right.
More to come on that. Anything else on this one? Okay, we're really racing through the agenda here. Okay. Review of a proposed native plant policy. Is there somebody out there, is anybody scheduled to speak?
I think so, yeah.
Speak for the trees?
If you like, I can.
Have a seat.
We left this one till last for you, so you.
Thank you very much. I just.
Did you run straight from the airport?
No, I just came straight from the airport.
Yes,
so-
that's dedication.
Oh, yeah, please, Alan, please do. So, my name's Chet Kerr. This has been something that, Charlotte, Alan, and Warwick Norton and I have been working on, communicating with Suzanne Nolan as whatever. And set the scene for this. The reason for thinking about this policy is to promote sustainable landscape and biodiversity through the community, through the use of native plants, and, reduce the impact of invasive plants, support the climate change projects that we've been doing a lot of, and hopefully maybe even reduce some expenses of landscaping expenses. This policy would only apply to village property and to village-funded projects requiring landscaping and planting. It would not apply.
Question about that? Sorry. Your comment about it only applies to village property. There is a provision in here that says the TPC in replantings.
You're absolutely right, and I'll get to that.
Oh,
So,
all right.
yeah, so,
I'll stop.
Okay, so-
Finish your intro. I'm
so
sorry.
there's a part of the tree commission in here,
Yeah.
and obviously the tree commission deals with private landowners as well. And what this provides is the tree commission will bring into the philosophy of the state plant in process as part of their tree commission efforts. But other than that, the requirements for use of native plants as set in this policy is really just for village property and not by the private
I'll let you
landowners.
finish and then I do want to revisit that one.
Okay. It would only apply to future plantings. It wouldn't require the village to go in and tear things out, but it would really kind of help direct the vision about what's to be done in the future. Other municipalities have done this. Terrytown's had this policy in place for 15 years. The County of Westchester's has this policy. New York State Parks has this policy. And there's a whole bunch of other communities in Connecticut and New York that have been working on this. The village has already been requiring the use of native plants in a lot of its proposals for, requests for proposals it puts out. I think when the Massive Park proposal was done, it required native plants. We have been working, again, Alan's done a lot of great work on this, and with Charlotte, and we're talking to Suzanne, and we came and presented to the board in August of 2023 about this, and we've done a lot of tinkering, and you can see it in the nature of the policy. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. We have that in the parks, they'll use native plants, but we recognize that actually turf fields and large grassy fields, that's almost impossible to do. It turns out the seed stock for turf and grass almost all comes from Japan or Europe. And I spent a lot of time talking to turf specialists in the golf industry and whatever about this, and I think we've kind of carved that one out. We talk about using native trees, but there's been a carve out to accommodate and reflect the fact, something Alan's been very sensitive to, is that there's places along Main Street where, because of where higher power wires are, whatever, there has to be some flexibility in there to ensure that if it's appropriate to use a non-native tree that can grow better, that's fine as well.
So I think you gave an 80% number for street trees.
Yeah, I think that was what Alan had suggested, and that, I have to say, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little bit of, let's use 80 and not 83%.
No,
It's no magic, but it was designed to reflect the reality that we have some unique challenges in planting trees along Main Street under high power lines. And I think, and I have to defer to Alan's expertise on this about what is the appropriate trees to put in there. The other thing that just another carve out here is, there's several places along Main Street, the top of Main Street, in front of Village Hall, where there's planters, and the beautification committee has been for many years planting very beautiful, aesthetically pretty plants that are often non-native, they're annuals and stuff like that. And so we wrestled for a long time about how to deal with that. And what the policy basically does is it goes to the superintendent of recreation, Maureen, and say, Maureen, do what, try to build this into your thinking, but for those situations, you can use your discretion and whatever to allow annual plants. So again, it's trying to find the right balance between promoting this policy and educating the public and educating the staff, and yet reflecting the reality that there's not a lot of annual natives that are great, they're hard to get and stuff like that. And so again, we tried in the language to provide the flexibility and not have some kind of rigid thing here, but it's really, I think the goal of it is to severalfold. One, to really build native plants into our planting, and because I think it's really good for the environment, it's good, it's consistent with our sustainability. This is a good education process as well, often kind of educating people about benefits of all of this. I think the village can take a leadership role in that. And again, I look at what Westchester's done, the state parks have done, and what Terrytown has done has really been beneficial in that way. But I think it keeps within it enough flexibility that we can accommodate it. You'll also see that there is a provision at the very end about suggesting that the Village Sustainability Director and the Green Policy Task Force look for funding opportunities to think about how to put some of this, maybe in a broader scale, put in place. And I'll give you one good example, just because I have all these ideas. I went to Maureen and I said, Maureen, it'd be really an interesting thing to do would be to think about creating not just having lawn, but having some kind of native, more kind of sustainable native plants. I just sent to her, the New York State Parks has just developed a whole new no-mow policy for parts of its parks.
Yeah, you were talking about.
Yes, and I was suggesting at the northern end of Madison, take a 50-foot, get some funding, take a 50-foot area, and not just have lawn, but plant native plants and create a riparian buffer and use it as a pilot project. So learn about it, think about it, get people aware of it. In one way, it's out of sight, out of mind, so it's not threatening everybody. But it gives an opportunity for people to see, there are things you can do, and there are going to be places where we need to be sensitive to, especially in the riparian buffer areas, not just on the Hudson River, but along Barney Brook and other places as well. And so learning and helping the staff and the constituents, the residents of the village learn about it. So that's my pitch. I don't know if you've got anything else to say, Alan, but.
Sounds like I just need to give some answers.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
Yes. Now it comes. Alan, it's your turn.
It's a good move, Chad. I in reading through this, I sort of reduced it to, I don't know, maybe 5 or so rules. And it was, and the reason I'm doing this is that I have questions that kind of key off of some of them. So it's use 100% native plants on new plantings in the parks, except seed and grassy areas. I could understand that. Use 100% native plants on new plantings on village facilities, except street trees where it's 80%. We can quibble about whether it should be percentage or some other measurement, but I understand the point, and you're trying to introduce a level of flexibility for when it's just impractical, so there's a way to make that work. And then committees of the village and the village itself for planting beds use native plants where feasible except for annuals. So feasible comes up a couple of times. Anything is feasible. I'm not sure I like the word feasible, but we don't disagree. That's between us. I can't speak for anybody else on this board. I've learned that. So the question, I have is, should it be a different word where preferable, where whatever, and we can, I'm not expecting us to work that out tonight, but feasibility, as long as we're willing to spend as much money, as somebody demands, anything is feasible.
So if I quickly
yeah.
respond,
Yeah, we can
let
make
me respond to that. So,
This one's a good lawyer question,
so
since we're playing
this,
with words.
this was something we
Yeah.
spent a lot of time trying to find the right balance.
That
Yeah.
word changed.
I have no doubt.
But it comes up to this, there are, part of the problem here is just the fact that the availability of native plants on a large scale has changed a lot in the last couple of years. And so it might be for certain projects, it might be much more feasible than other ones. And so,
It's gotta be reasonably available, in other words,
yes, it has to be reasonably
And I
available.
only stuck reasonable in front of it because if I could get it and it cost me, $20,000, then that's probably not,
That's right.
reasonably available.
That's right, and so we're trying to accommodate that. We are trying to accommodate, obviously, I don't have this expertise, but there's certain areas where because of the soil content, because of the dryness or whatever, certain plants are gonna be better than others in terms of survivability, in terms of growth and whatever. And so if there's a different word to use to build in that kind of thing that we can't anticipate everything, and we're trying, the goal here is to encourage people to think about this
Yeah,
and
we
to
should,
push it.
we should defer in the direction that gets us native plants.
But not lock us into spending all kinds of money or having to put in plants that are not gonna thrive. That's not the interest at all. That doesn't do anybody any good. So if you have a better word, like a
I know,
John
If
Siegel,
I did, I would have given it to you already, but I'll think about it.
okay.
Doesn't it feel like it's like defining what you mean by feasible, like saying that it's like cost, that it's like, it's also like availability?
Yeah, you could have
all
a.
of that.
So-
Saying like,
We
so-
can have a list of definitions.
Yeah, but let me comment on that. So there's always a struggle when you're drafting a resolution, as you know, between putting more specificity in to give that very content
Yeah.
and then creating a Byzantine mess for people to argue about in rooms like this.
That's
what we
that
do.
keeps lawyers
And
employed.
so my personal approach, not necessarily the one that you guys would choose, because you're smarter than I am, is to, I worked for a judge for a year, and when we first got there, he gave us all hats that said KISS on them. He said, figure it out. It's keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And that is a strategy that I think, especially in drafting, we do. Now, you may find in a year that you guys are gonna spend half your trustee meetings fighting over what's feasible, and then we'll have to do something different. But
Okay, all
this
right.
is what
I
I think we should.
I just wanted to also add that an awful lot of this is already implemented in the village. I mean, if you talk to Larry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The request for proposals almost always ask for native plants now. It's something we're already doing, and even down to the tree commission policy, that's already a policy of the tree commission, but it's been done administratively within the committee itself for the last 8 or 10 years. So a lot of this is trying to pull into focus things that are already happening in the village. But with changes in your committees and changes in your administration, they could be forgotten and lost.
Yeah.
So I thought it was a good idea to start working on this when I realized we were changing our Parks Department head. I was leaving the tree commission, there were different things changing in the village. Let's get this in writing and make sure going forward, we keep doing what we're already doing.
And I don't disagree. I mean, this is, if I were to pick a percentage, I say you're about 90% there, and there's, tweaking to be done. But so there's 3 more sort of rules that I pulled out, that landscaping contracts should provide for native plants. And then we talked about that the the tree commission should, I put recommend native plants. I don't know exactly what, for replacements, which will impact private individuals, and then the last, and I'm gonna come back to that in a second, but, and then your last rule was no trees that are prohibited by New York State, which no one's gonna
That's my
argue with
law,
that.
you're stuck.
So my.
You're not
my-
changing that.
Yes, and I'm in complete agreement. My issue with the tree commission having to recommend native plants, I know they're not locked in, is what do you do about circumstances? I have, 150-year-old Copper Beech sitting outside, and if and when that goes, you telling me I can't go out and find another Copper Beech, because it's probably not native to this area, I got magnolias, yeah.
You communicate with the tree commission and tell them your desire to plant a Copper Beech, and we make an exception for it. We do this all the time. So if people come back to
Except,
us.
that doesn't go to your earlier argument that you're trying to set up rules that, and I'm conscious of what you're doing because I try to do the same thing. Everything, I had this conversation with the Facilities Planning Committee, I said, what you're doing has to survive me, and I was pointing at the chairs, because people will sit in our, stand in our shoes, sit in our chairs. So you're creating a rule that says we'll look back at the language, and I don't think we're in disagreement about where we want to get to, but it has to be clear that they have a measure of discretion in certain circumstances.
Right.
Another example I can give you, which I don't have, is if somebody's got an array of trees and they're not native, is somebody gonna tell them, hey, I'm sorry, that one just died, you gotta,
We just did this down in Matheson Park on Matheson Drive South.
okay, I get it.
Down the road of evergreens, they wanted to put in European.
You're a reasonable guy, I'm waiting for the one who shows up who's not reasonable. That's the only point I'm making, and I'm sure it's language that we can, maybe.
It's possibly even a change in the tree code, because currently we allow people to appeal, but we're not telling them necessarily in paperwork, you can appeal this if you want.
Got it.
But they can, it's in the tree code, and they do, they come back to us all the time.
Okay.
So if I could just
Yeah,
say,
of
and
course.
and I get all that, and again, we have tried to build that in here, and there's a balance here between having the village speak with a voice to get people to think about it and to educate people.
Which I 100%.
But you're right, someone will have a tree stand of non-native trees, and one collapses and they wanna replace that because of aesthetics or whatever, and I think that's something the tree commission has been navigating for time and been managing well, and this is not necessarily intended to change that dramatically, other than the fact just maybe a little oomph to make people think about it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't I mean, this may not be the language, but shall encourage people, when you're making replacements. And I'm not trying to weaken what you're doing, and I'm not even telling you that's the language you should use. I wanna go back and reread it again, having had the conversation
I
with you.
can tell you why we would oppose changing it to shall encourage. They're gonna always not plant the native tree.
Okay.
As soon as it says shall encourage
All right.
or try.
That's,
So that's why generally when we issue a replant agreement, our first statement is must be a native tree. But you can always appeal the
Can
finding.
I guess I have a question.
Good.
So, I mean, and I know nothing about trees on purpose, okay. I renovated my house.
I now know two things,
My
running and
line
trees.
was the
Not
outside
your
of my
thing.
house, okay? They took me to a nursery, I was like, I don't see anything, anyways. So is there a case, and maybe, do we want to encourage, right? I think there is this idea that you have non-native trees and you have 9 of them in a row and like one falls. I mean, do we want to still encourage the planting, like how do you, without every time saying go ahead and plant the same non-native tree, say like, maybe you could try this other tree, it might look kind of nice, right? Like, or find something. I think I guess I'm sort of concerned also with the language of like shall encourage, because I think if you want to move towards like actually encouraging people, then if you can work with, and it's important that, right, the tree commission work with people to say, okay, what are the options for trees that might work with those non-native trees? I feel like otherwise you're gonna always get the exception.
Because shall encourage is toothless, right? There's no
Yeah.
enforcement of shall
Well,
encourage.
I mean, maybe codify what you're doing, which is formally say, maybe say that there's an appeal process, but don't explain.
I guess I don't quite understand what the question is.
My question
Well,
is,
I think
should
she's
we be
supporting you,
yeah,
so don't
supporting you.
argue.
What I'm saying is,
Situation.
just like that. Yeah.
She's saying I was wrong.
You said what she said, yes. Yeah.
We do send out
Yeah.
this possibility.
No, I'm saying like when you're working, yeah, no, I'm saying like when you're, I guess what I'm saying is like the opposite of, you know, you don't always
have to be more
necessarily wanna,
forceful.
you wanna be
I get
like
it.
more like, and forceful in a helpful way.
Yeah.
Well,
Like, which is like, here's some options, because otherwise you'll always end up with a, like, I have 8 trees, 1 fell, like, I can't possibly change that tree, it has to be the same that's non-native that's there, or do you say, so, you know, it's okay, like, maybe you have 8 trees of one kind and one little stick out
And how you
tree
do
that.
It's interesting, this is the
Yeah.
clause we're stuck on.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of these, I mean, the
But
truth is,
it is interesting because we walk that line, it's a
Yeah.
very fine line between trying to encourage people not to plant another Japanese cherry tree.
Yeah.
And instead to plant a native that can do just as beautiful
The
a
reason,
function, and it's hard.
the reason we're stuck on this is because this is the only provision in here
That's
that affects private
homeowners.
property
Yeah,
owners.
yeah,
And
yeah.
now it does, for
Right,
me,
whenever you guys
but I
are
will
ready.
say it does, it only affects them to the extent that there's a replant agreement for a replacement tree.
Right.
It doesn't impact what anyone
Right,
does
so
any other time.
I
on
wanna
the
ask a
property.
question about that, because I think I can game this rule, if I remember the rules correctly, because I've had to replace lots of trees. What happens if I just let it sit there until it dies? Yes, and I've done everything you told me, I think. What if I just let it die? You don't get a replanting agreement.
You do not.
So you do not want to be in the position where you are encouraging people to game this that way. So maybe you're right, maybe there is something to look at the tree code and figure out how do we get what you want without telling people, just leave your dead tree up for a while.
I've been feeling that in the replant agreement when it's sent to them,
Yeah.
or in the binding they receive from the tree commission, the statement that's in the code, that they can appeal the decision back to the tree commission and
Okay,
then to the.
that may be,
Gives them
yeah.
at least the understanding that it's flexible, and right now that's not in those forms, it's just in the code, so.
So going back to the,
Go.
I'm sorry. to-
No,
Go.
I gotta.
No, go ahead.
I
No,
don't
go ahead.
monopolize.
No, but go if you,
My observation in all this from the beginning is that I was hoping and expecting that the policy was gonna be applicable to trees and shrubs and not go further than that, because to me, it seems like the annuals and the grasses and all of those things at the low end of the totem pole are triggering all the exceptions, and it's probably what you spent your most time figuring out these exceptions. So if the exceptions are so large, then what are you really accomplishing by having that class in this law?
So,
That was my argument from the beginning. You didn't go in that direction, but here we are.
and you
So-
said that in August of 23.
I
So I was
did.
gonna ask a question about it.
so if I can respond to that.
Yeah.
You know, there are other communities that look at this as a tree issue, just as a tree issue. And this is a little more ambitious, and it's designed to, again, educate and encourage people to think more broadly. Because you know, if anything that I'm a crappy gardener, but one thing I've learned about this, it's amazing, it has changed my view of what's around me. And I think it's changed my sense of aesthetics in a way that's really interesting. And I again, people do what the hell they want, excuse me, but I think really encouraging people for a variety of reasons, and it's a way for the community to bring people in to support what you guys are already trying to do, the sustainability, affecting climate change and whatever, in an effective way. So you could make it very narrow, it only applies to trees over 10 feet or something like that, but I don't, that's not what I suggest we do. But I'm just a guy, so.
And just so you know, from the outset, we differed on this. I thought it should just be a tree policy, so that's why it's been a year plus in the making. But I think we've come down.
It's a lengthy disagreement.
Yeah, no.
No, we were trying to get it right.
I-
We were working hard on it.
I think we came down with a compromise, though, that allows every participant in the village, everyone who's doing something, to continue doing what they're doing. It doesn't ruin anyone's joy of making flower boxes or whatever else they wanna do. It addresses things like the War Memorial and the Trade Center Memorial in the park, because it gives Maureen the option of doing what she needs to do in those places to accommodate annuals and non-native natives. In terms of grasses, Larry, one of the biggest problem is non-native ornamental grasses. And that's part of the reason you start working down this chain, is because if you just say trees, and then you go, well, there are a lot of problems with shrubs. I mean, look at the eradication efforts we're having to do in the woods now to pull out shrubs that have taken over the woods. Well, then you just come down the chain a little further and you come to ornamental grasses, and the miscanthus that was planted in the park down there has taken over, and it's spreading and it's subseeding. It's an invasive, it's listed as an invasive in Pennsylvania, not yet in New York. So
It looks
as
great.
you, it looks
That's the
great,
problem.
oh,
But
it's
it's
a
not-
problem, it's
it's
beautiful,
not
and
helpful.
people think it's a native
No, I get
plant
it, but
because it's so
it's-
beautiful, but it's not.
But the,
And so as you come down that chain, you start going, well, what about this? Well, what about this? And what about this? So there,
But I wanted to, because when, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but my memory when you guys came to us in August of '23 was, this is about what the village is going to do. And because you guys control what you put on village property, and this should be the way I remember you, and I remember you.
That's correct.
And I told you I used to Jim Gaffney line that I'm indoorsy, and I needed you to explain to me why this was important, and you did a great job, and you totally convinced me. But the thing was, I thought one of the takeaways was from that meeting, why we asked you to go back, was that, and it sounds like you've done some of this because you mentioned Maureen a lot, was that to have a conversation with the various village agencies that work with this, to make sure that the policy would actually work, to make sure it was financially feasible, things like that. Do I take it from?
So let me respond to that. Your question is, did we go back? I personally did not know that. I know we sent it to Larry and I
we
don't-
provided feedback,
Yeah,
which,
so,
and they were responsive to the feedback. So my concern is on a higher level, not the specific provisions here, because they were responsive to our landscape architect who had reviewed this as well. They pointed out some discrepancies, and all of that seems to have been taken care
Because
of.
that was the primary reason I thought that we weren't acting a year and a half ago, or a year and.
well, I think that's true, but I will tell you this, the policy that we come up with, I think it's actually was a learning process for us as well, and it was, and I think this better reflects a better understanding of how to really do this in place. And so, maybe you should have done it a year ago, but I'm honestly happy that.
No, that wasn't, but my point I was asking, I'm sorry to interrupt you, was I want to make sure that due diligence step was asked for had gone on, and you're saying it has.
It has, yeah, no, that
I
part
met
was
with
done.
DPW, and I've spoken with Maureen, and I spoke with Jim Englishby.
So,
Because my understanding was that was the main, I mean, that's how I walked out of that room, thinking that the main reason why we weren't acting was because we had to check to make sure it was feasible.
No,
So-
I'm at the point where I can easily say that if the board wants to have a policy that covers this breadth of plant materials, then we're okay with what's written here. It's been reviewed, they've updated it, everything's
my
fine.
next
That was
question
my
was,
primary-
my next question
I'm
was,
not-
can
I'm
we
not
do
there.
it and what's it cost?
Yeah, that was my primary
Um,
concern, so
Uh,
that's why I wanted to get that out.
So again, with that in mind, I don't know what it'll cost. I don't know, I actually don't know.
well,
how
cost
often-
relative to what we already
I
do.
understand,
It's-
I
it's
understand,
the
but I don't
incremental.
know, for example,
Yeah.
how much cost is spent as plants get normally replaced, and if you suddenly say, well, we're gonna replant it with native plants, not other types of plants. I have not done that assessment,
Okay.
I don't know.
I mean, I can tell you over the last years that I've been buying, I buy the trees for DPW. And 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it was very expensive for me to go out and purchase native trees that were appropriate, especially for Main Street. And much cheaper to buy calorie pears, which are sort of like Bradford pears, they're terrible, but they're cheap. Over the years, Rosedale in particular, but other nurseries have gotten wind of the fact that Irvington wants native trees, Dobbs wants native trees, Terrytown wants native trees. They've started getting them. So now they are competitive with the prices of the non-native trees. So that actually has been a learning curve to see that as we've demanded those things, interestingly, the wholesalers like Prospero are not doing it, but Rosedale is, so that's great. I kind of could imagine the same thing happening with native perennials. I spoke with the person at Carlson that has put together the corner planters for the parks that worked in the last couple of years. It would be extraordinarily expensive to fill those with all native plants right now. But there are more growers coming online in New York State and Pennsylvania in particular. So there's more of that plant material coming into the trade. And as it does, the prices will come down. That's where feasible comes into play. If feasible means affordable, because we looked at the cost of planters now and what planters would be if we immediately said they had to be native, they would be 3 or 4 times the price. It would start-
Plus, I'm not certain how attractive they are with native
Yeah.
plants. I don't think the natives are all that, I mean, you put them out there for decoration,
Yeah.
not to
I mean-
sustain the environment, so it's.
Okay, but that, you're right,
In
you're
a,
right.
in a pot.
But that is why we have built that thing and
I
to give
understood that.
Maureen the opportunity to do that. And, but I.
Which is why I don't think it's necessary, but that's,
I will-
I'll stop now.
But I
promise.
will push back a little bit,
Right.
if I can, that a lot of this is, you're right, you know, you have your traditional little pretty lines of flowers, but there is a different aesthetic learning about this whole process. And people who are interested in what they can do to help advance sustainability, whatever, I think is learning. It's not gonna happen overnight, and people may not change, but I do think that the kind of traditional view of what looks pretty still looks pretty, but there's alternatives to that as well. And this is in part to give people an opportunity to think about that and push it. You know, I have here just if this helps, and I'll send everybody this. There's the PACE land use school has done native plantings as a strategy for local governments, and really talking about the benefits to help flooding control and whatever, and thinking about how you're using native plants to really manage your landscape in a very positive way. So there's broader benefits to this beyond just, you know, whatever, and so that I think have to be taken into account as well. Won't happen overnight. We're not having people pull up everything and replace it all. But there are a lot of benefits to governments thinking about this and moving this direction. And as I say, Westchester's done this, state parks have done this, Terrytown has done this.
I'd be interested, I'm assuming we can get a hold of their policy, right?
I have it right here if you'd like it.
I
Yeah,
guess I
Terrytown
can get
doesn't,
all-
they don't, Terrytown doesn't do it for annuals. I'm really hung up on the annuals,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
But-
you're not gonna want what is native to be out there as a decorative planting for a limited duration.
Right.
And Terrytown's not doing it. Terrytown's the one that identified Carlson Nurseries as the source for all these pots. And we purchase them on a kind of a joint
Well,
basis.
but to Chet's point, they do accept annuals,
Right,
I think.
yeah, it's specifically in that resolution, we try to draft it.
Not,
away.
I understand, not to
You
your
include it at the top-
satisfaction.
You include it at the top, and then you accept almost all of it, but it has to go through a discretionary approval process by the Parks and Recreation. I think that's way over the top in terms of administration.
It
It's
is
not necessary.
interesting, if you talk to anybody on the environmental committees in Terrytown, they will tell you their policy applies to perennials and annuals. And then you point to the geraniums hanging from the lampposts of every lamp pole in
Yeah.
Terrytown, and they go, oh, well, except those, and then you plant to
Yeah,
the exhibition boxes that are on the streets, and
the
like,
exception is the
what about the
rule.
daylilies in there? Well, except those.
And isn't
Can I
it
So-
ask a different question?
the whole
Okay.
risks of using non-native, if they're like in a box, in a decorative box, it's different than if they're planted in the ground, right? Like obviously the risks are much less.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Definitely.
yeah.
I mean, there was a thought at one point about excluding anything that's planted above ground. And just say planters and the like are not covered. I mean, that was a thought at one point. But again, we've done this as a group. This is what we come down to because we think this works. Yes, I mean, Terrytown's policy is not perfect. Neither is Westchester's. Because you can go to any Westchester park and find non-native annuals and perennials planted today.
Mhm.
So it's there, it's in writing, but it's not strictly enforced because it's kind of not feasible parts of it.
We're just trying to figure out the risk and the analysis, you know, where is the real, and I think the huge concern is what gets planted, so I mean, you know.
Well, I think there's a difference between what is actually a concern in terms of ecological impact and what is a concern, as Chet would say, in terms of educating people about these policies and bringing a policy forward that if the village wants to be an example and wants to lead, what do? Well, then maybe we go further so that people can take our example and emulate it. Or do we just want to narrowly define it to the things that actually impact the biodiversity and the environment and things like that? They're two different things, I think.
I am not opposed to the education, but I think obviously ecology, biodiversity is the most, I mean, that's, back in August 2023, I keep saying that like it was this halcyon time or whatever, but like, and that goes, I mean, that's what I walked away with, that's what you educated to me as to be the importance of it, right, is that, right, so.
I mean, I guess the other thing is, you know, aesthetics change over time, right? I think if you look at native plants and you're like, this is not, you know, these like perfect flowers that I'm used to, then you're never gonna like a native garden, right? I think that is also something that maybe we have to shift in what we think is like, you know, looks good, right? I think that can change. Not at my house. My husband has this crazy little native garden at the corner that's nuts, but you know, somebody else can make it cute, not in my house.
But I think that's
Yeah.
right, and again, what we've done in the very last provision is to try and do that, you know, propose that, you know, pick some pilot projects. You're right, aesthetics, you know, some people will never change their aesthetics, you know, they'll always want certain looks, other ones will want different things. But there's good ecological reasons for promoting this if we can. And if we can do that in a way that doesn't prevent people from having the aesthetics that they've had, and we try to accommodate that, but still create a mechanism to be supportive of the broader things that all of you've been working hard and Charlotte's been working hard on. I think, from my perspective, I'm an advocate for thinking that's a good thing.
And we tried to think about things like the planting area at the top of Main Street next to Field Point. What happens there? That is, I don't know if that's, I think Field Point plants that area. I don't know
No,
who
that's
owns it.
village.
Which side of the street?
I'm talking about
The north side of-
the divider, when you come out of the new
Yes,
parking lot.
that's not us.
That's Field Point. But does that belong to Field Point, that area?
We don't plant it, not that I know of.
But again, we're trying to look at areas like that where there are displays of tropical plants. Right now, they're impatiens most years. If that were village property, we would have to think about that, like exactly what's gonna go in there. And how are we gonna replace that color? Tropicals bloom all year, natives don't, so.
Got it.
um,
So, I'm sorry, go ahead,
No,
yeah,
that's okay.
please.
While we're speaking about Field Point, I'm reflecting back on the conversation we had about the parking lot and the trees replanting and that. So I'm wondering how this policy might interact with that, right? So as you'll recall, we have the Field Point lot, trees taken down to accommodate the expansion of the lot. Some invasive trees were left up.
So it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that implicates a different question, and that is to what extent, when the village does a project, it turns to the tree commission automatically or whatever. And I don't know, Alan, maybe you can say whether, does that happen or not, or?
No, but Larry and I have had some conversations about that.
And actually, today,
Yeah.
at our capital planning meeting, Charlotte was there, and there was a conversation with a whole bunch of us, and I don't know how many of you were either, I know you were participating, you may have been watching, but the takeaway is that when we do those capital planning meetings, we'll get the spreadsheet of all the items that are listed and either get it to Charlotte or whoever she tells us we're supposed to get it to, which will presumably include the tree commission, so that they can have input. There you go. You know, that particular project at the top of the hill, those trees that remained are there because before anybody said anything, the neighbors said, "Oh my God," I'm paraphrasing and I hope you're not listening, "Oh my God, what are you doing? You've just, you know, wiped out what is essentially the shield between these cars and our house." So I think that is why I didn't direct it, but I wouldn't surprise me if that isn't why some of those trees were left.
Todd Smith told me that they were concerned, the building company, I forget their name.
Oh, that's not even in the contract, so it would have had to be a village expense. That's a different issue. That, yeah, yes, there are other reasons for why they might have been
Yeah, but going
maintained.
forward, Todd and I had already talked about as these new trees come in, because we look at 2 years down the road.
Yes, yeah,
Those are weed trees.
understood,
And they need
and
to come
apparently
down.
the lanternflies love them.
So as
That's
the
what-
new
that's
trees
how
grow
they
in, those
breathe.
trees can come down.
Yes,
And,
yeah.
it's a
Yeah,
process.
I don't think it was done with malice, it was done because somebody else complained about the opposite problem before any of you could even, you know, write an email.
Right.
And I'm not sure this policy will solve that problem every time, but one thing this policy might do is it might put a little click in people's mind, oh, we should be thinking about, do we have, maybe have to take down some trees, we have Atlantis trees there, which are lanternflies are just, that's what they breed on, versus other ones. How do we make those decisions?
Right, so that's
In a
part of
way.
your education.
Yeah, I think that can really help. And again, trying to help people learn and think about issues that honestly, I never thought about before I got involved with all this stuff. And now I think about it a lot, and they're helpful issues, they're thoughtful issues. Other questions?
Anything else?
I mean, I love the educational component, I love like maybe having showcase like places for us to learn about native plants, what are beautiful ones that might inspire folks. I think the comments that are on that, I'm very strongly support.
So going to that point, one thing, there's a lot of effort up at O'Hara to do this very thing. That's a little out of sight and out of mind for a lot of people, unfortunately. And I've talked to Maureen, and she seems interested, if somebody comes up with some money, to think about trying something that would maybe do more than Madison. And there's an opportunity for people to learn from that and to figure out if it works or doesn't. So I think there's a real chance for that, which would be great. And this, again, is just designed a way to encourage that thinking.
Yeah. Well, when we get, I'm assuming we will get to the point where we're adopting something in the not too distant future, this or something like it. So it's worth promoting at that point in time. I'm happy to do, to the extent people are reading it, a mayor's letter, and put out, as much as we can, try to get some articles that get people to focus on, hey, this is a change, this is what we're doing. We can always say we're following the example of some of the other nearby communities, maybe even going a step further. I mean, what I'd like to do, having heard what everybody has said here, is go back now and reread the thing and think, okay, are there ways in which I might tweak it? And I would love if you would send me most of the
Yes, I will
stuff you
send
got
it to you.
sitting in front of you.
Yeah. So let me say this, I think we have benefited from having different views, Tinker, and my experience doing what I've done all my career is the other people bring in their ideas, I encourage it. So please do, I may push back, or some of us may push back, but I think the outcome of that is really positive, and I think that's great, so that's great.
Yeah, I would say, as I think I said at one point, our differences are in the just barely double-digit percentages. Most of what you're trying to do, I think
That 80% is actually, I just wanted to say.
Yeah.
I looked at a lot of policies and municipalities
Yeah.
that do have exceptions. And the ballpark probably ranged between 75 and 95%. And then I looked at how many trees we plant each year and generally what mark we were hitting. And we were always hitting, I would say in the mid-80s, like
Okay.
85, 84%. This past year, we exceeded it. But the problem is on the south side of Main Street, under the wires, those are high power lines. North side is not, the south side is. And we can't plant anything that's gonna go straight up.
Yeah,
It also can't go sideways.
Yeah.
Because of the trucks and the pedestrians, so it has to go V-shaped,
Yeah.
it can only go V-shaped.
which illustrates that no matter what we put in the policy, they're gonna do what is not gonna be
So-
endanger people.
So it becomes very limited what we can plant.
Well,
there.
the people end up cutting the center. I assume
No,
that's
but
how
I'm
they go
saying, you said you
V-shaped.
need that kind of tree, are there a lot of trees that do that?
Actually, we do cut out the center,
Yeah.
let them get up to a certain
Yeah.
point, and we cut out the center and let them, they could be around the wires, so that's all we can do.
Yeah.
But I would say this year, actually, we did hit almost 90% native planting this year, but not most years, it's usually about 85.
What's
so.
the most common native street tree?
Depends on what Rosedale's got in stock. This year,
Whatever Rosedale's selling
this
that
year was
week.
very much Tupelo trees, black and Tupelo trees and pin oaks.
Got it.
This year, so
Tupelo does not sound like a native tree.
it is if you're from Mississippi. But black gum is native to the whole East Coast, so.
Okay,
Other questions?
buddy. All right, we're not gonna think about it for long. We'll
But thank you, I appreciate all the hard
take a look
thought.
at it soon.
We went through all the.
Yeah,
what you guys
that's
did
great.
For the last year and 3 months.
Especially when you're drafting as a committee.
Okay,
It's been fun.
good. A little fisticuffs, that's okay. Thank you
We're
very much.
lucky
Thanks.
we had Charlotte there to moderate.
Mr. Mayor, can I just ask one question?
I don't see why not.
Hopefully it's gonna be quick, not as difficult as the trees, but on the capital you know, when you guys are saying, hey, you have approval for a project and then the project, it hasn't happened in the funding. So I understand it from an accounting point, accrual, omnibus, do all that kind of stuff, so, and you can account for that with a special provision, but does the board and the administrators and everybody have a fail-safe switch where they say, hey, you know, now this is ballooned into something bigger than what we originally thought. We started in 2020, it turned into something else. Does it come up for a second vote?
I think the short answer to that is if they're spending more than the amount that was authorized for borrowing, or than the project originally was
Right.
budgeted at, and by that, let's say, you know, 5 plus 10.
Are you talking about my home improvement, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. They will
No,
end
because
up,
we're not paying.
they'll end up coming back to us. Would that be a fair statement? I mean, it is, these things don't happen in a vacuum, which is why we have a
Right.
monthly meeting of these capital projects. And if something's going awry, they come up pretty quickly.
Right, and if there's more pressing needs, or there's new technology, or there's new things, that's all considered, and so it's not like
I'll
a
give you
green
an
light.
example of that. We're trying to, we have a grant pending with Westchester County, and they rebid this is for electric vehicle chargers. And they have rebid them, and so that we expressed some concern, actually, you asked this question once or twice, whether the chargers that they were bidding it on would be, what their useful life would be, I think was your question. So that type of thing comes up all the time. In other words, we don't want to install a bunch of chargers that 2 years from now we gotta yank out because they're not good enough. And the technology has moved beyond that. So the answer is yes, we do examine, obviously until it goes into the ground, at which point it's in the ground. But we do take a look at that.
No, that's great, that was it, thank you.
Okay, no problem. And obviously, you'll come back for the actual capital budget discussions, which won't be till May or June, but happy to have you.
Great.
Thank you. I know we don't normally do this, but anybody else have any questions? I know they don't want me to do this.
Worksession usually is.
Yeah, okay. All right, then I will make a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Oh! Anybody else that eager?
Resounding seconds.
Okay, we're done.